There was a podcast where you were talking about hiring, how you hire for Bolt and what you guys look at. And there were three main points that you listed. We're looking for PMs who act as business owners. We're looking for PMs who think strategically, not tactically. You're looking for basic product mindset.
Many product managers are lost. What does strategic thinking actually mean? And when we speak about leverage points, there could be many things. Value proposition is split into two parts. So there is a hard value proposition. There is a soft value proposition.
And then there were three flavors, like understanding the dynamics of marketplace business, thinking outside of features, and culture, motivation, and soft skills.
The user's experience is like 5% the application, right? And 95% the offline experience that the user has. I would say a horrible thing right now, but the certifications, they might decrease your chances for getting a job.
It would be really amazing to go through these 6 points, maybe uncover them a little bit more. So, Mikhail, can you tell us about yourself?
Yeah. So, thank you, Nikolai. A bit of a background. So, for the past 3.5 years, I've been working at Bolt. Bolt is an Estonian unicorn focused on mobility, food delivery. I've been leading two verticals, which are micromobility or e-scooter, e-bike rental, and drive. Our car sharing and rentals. Those verticals, they are on the surface different, but fundamentally very similar. Prior to Bolt, I've been leading product at one of OLX's portfolio companies, which is called Avito. It's the biggest, one of the biggest classified platforms in the world, bigger than Craigslist, the infamous Craigslist, and with much better. So I've been leading buyer experience there and was responsible for the advertising revenues. It's been like a three-year ride journey, I think. Prior to that, for 3.5 years, I used to be a product lead at Yandex e-commerce, like mainly Yandex Market, also responsible for the buyer experience flows, like B2C mostly. Prior to that, for 2 years, I had my own startup in mobility area, tried to solve the parking availability problem, attracted venture capital with my co-founder. We successfully burned it. We couldn't monetize properly, failed the startup, but it was a great learning experience nonetheless. Gives you this like entrepreneurial mindset. Prior to that, for a range of years, I used to work as a junior and mid product manager in lesser known companies, like doing the hustle. Like frankly, back in the day, there wasn't even a term product management. Was like project management, IT management, or whatnot. And even prior to that, I was in academia, working on my PhD thesis, doing science. I mean, science is a big word though. Well, after finishing, wrapping up the PhD, I decided not to pursue teaching career. I found it a bit too boring, to be honest. So that's a helicopter view of my past background.
Nice. And now you're a group product manager at Bolt, and what it means, you have different verticals under you, and also that you hire product managers. And probably this will be the focus of this podcast, the focus of this episode. There was a podcast where you were talking about hiring, how you hire for Bolt and what you guys look at. And there were three main points that you listed. One point is we're looking for PMs who act as business owners. The second was we're looking for PMs who think strategically, not tactically, and you're looking for basic product mindset. And then there were three flavors, like understanding the dynamics of marketplace business, thinking outside of features, and culture, motivation, and soft skills. It would be really amazing to go through these 6 points pretty much, maybe uncover them a little bit more, dig deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And probably just makes sense to go straight into the business ownership. Like, what did you mean by this business ownership?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nikolai. So I think that's what distinguishes Bolt from many classic product management companies out there, is that we have an assumption that product managers need to act as co-owners of the business and influence whatever decisions are being made on various levels, and not just think in terms of I'm going to develop this feature in the app, or I'm going to like fix this bug or like change this design, but also think outside the box. Like, how can we influence operations to improve their processes? How can we reduce costs, like to make this business working? Or how can we improve, I don't know, marketing so that the business would work? So we kind of put product managers in the shoes of a startup entrepreneur, right? Where you have to put on a lot of hats and try to fix problems in the business rather than just in the features alone, right? And of course, this has its nuances because depending on the maturity of the business, probably your scope of ownership would be different, right? If we're talking about like a very early stage business, I don't know, like when I just joined, micromobility was more or less early stage, and Drive basically launched the day I joined the company. And we had to do a lot of stuff. So we stepped in the shoes of operations. We got on the ground. We tried to actually do like servicing on the ground, even swap batteries ourselves. We tried to work alongside our various functional partners, try to understand their perspective. We worked together with the business partners and so on. But if we're looking at a more mature vertical, say, I don't know, rides, it has been around for like 10 years. It's the core business. You already have like centers of expertise. And each center of expertise can have its own leverage on the business, because whatever you do in the app could have massive impact on the business as well, because that's your touch point for the majority of customers that come in, right? So I would say that depending on where you're going, like which specific vertical you're going to, the level of business ownership expected from you would be different. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't think like an owner of the business. So if you see that something is fatally wrong, like there is a flaw at how we approach things, then you should definitely step outside of the boundaries of your function and try and fix it. So that's what we imply by business ownership.
I'll try to kind of bring arguments against what you were saying. Probably
Sure.
throughout the whole episode, I will try to bring these arguments. And the first thing that I thought was about the responsibilities, that it sounds like product manager seemed like a central point of decision making, like the center point of how we do business in this vertical. But based on other talks, it seems like there is a team, and the team kind of decides what we do next, how we do, or the execution relies on the team. And probably there's no like one product manager per product. It's still a little bit like divided. So in reality, product manager probably does not really have full responsibility or full authority to make those changes. But maybe in a Bolt, it's a bit different.
So maybe like three things, right? So one is, if product manager was the center of all the decision making, product manager would be a bottleneck, right? So it's not that we're putting ourselves in the center. It's more that we're trying to influence the organization to move in a certain direction. Second point is, yes, so the ownership is fragmented, right? So depending on the domain, depending on the function that you work with, there is a final owner that has a say, right? And within this like ownership structure, there are of course like product managers that have their own product portfolio and they optimize for it. They have their own goals and so on. However, the decision making is done in collaboration typically, right? So there is an operational perspective to things. There is, say, marketing perspective to things. There is a product perspective. Maybe some data analytics perspective. It's typically blended with the product. And whatever makes the most sense, then typically we make a decision like that. So there is no direct authority, but you should be able to influence anyways. That's the tricky part of the job, but it's exciting as well.
And how do you influence?
Well, typically two things work for me. So one is you really need to be freaking excited about it, right? You personally need to believe that what you're doing makes the most sense and it's going to move the needle. That by itself will help you buy companionship, right? And support from the teams around you. And secondly, you really need to have in-depth understanding of what you're actually doing, because there are smart people all around. They're going to ask you for data and you need to show them that, hey, this is how it works. This is like how things are related and this is the approximate impact that you're going to get out of it. And the last but not the least, you need to have a very specific ask from people, right? If you just come in and say like, hey, I'm excited about this, like, what do you think? It's not going to end anywhere. You need to come up with a specific request. I want that much resource from you, or I want that much time from you, or like, I want those budgets and so on. Stuff like that.
And so it's like quite pragmatic. Like
Yep.
you really know your stuff. Like, you know your domain.
Yep.
And you really know that this something will move the needle, and that's why you ask for it. So kind of like almost 3-step process to know how to influence. Like, it's not really about influencing people. It's like, oh yeah, it's common sense. This guy, he knows his stuff. He knows how to move, what kind of metric we move, and how to move the needle. So let's go and do it because it makes sense. Okay. And back then you were also talking that you need to understand how business functions. What does it mean, like how business functions? Like, for example, if we take something specific, in your case, micromobility, the scooters, what would mean that I understand how business functions?
No, it's a great question, Nikolai. So you need to understand the fundamentals of the business. And what do I mean by that? Multiple things. So one, if we take micromobility as an example, it is a low margin business. Why low margin? Because it's very asset heavy. You have scooters that you need to finance, and they're always going to be on your balance. Two, it's very operationally heavy, which means that the large chunk of your business is about picking up the scooters, repairing the scooters, swapping the batteries, and all that sorts of stuff. And three, it's a very price sensitive type of a business, right? So the user is typically very price sensitive. They're not ready to overpay. They have a certain kind of a premium in mind that they're ready to spend for this trip, and not more than that. Of course, like there's versatility. When you look at the business from this perspective, you start thinking differently, right? If it's a low margin business, then it means that you don't have much room for mistake or experimentation. If it is a price sensitive business, then you need to optimize for the best prices. If it is an operationally heavy business, then you need to reduce the operational costs and improve efficiency. And you can clearly see that those elements are interconnected. Once you reduce the costs, you can offload those costs into price savings for the user, which means like more user acquisition. And that means like more revenues, like better top line and so on. And then, of course, there is a word of mouth effect that kicks in, and you have this whole flywheel going. So lower prices, more users come in, you're more operationally efficient, there are effects of scale, and so on. So once you understand all of those dynamics, make much better decisions than if you just look at the app itself and look at the features that the app has, because it's a very narrow-minded view. The user's experience is probably 10% or maybe like 5% the application, right? And 95% the offline experience that the user has. So it's very important to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. So it's, again, a lot about understanding the business context and kind of the domain that you work in. We'll probably talk a little bit more about the business context of the marketplace. But there is one more thing that you mentioned in business ownership. It's understanding how profit and loss statements work and understanding key financial metrics. As the guy who graduated from business and economics, I kind of get them, but the counter argument would be, it doesn't seem like all product managers actually have an access to financial data. Like, I met some people who work in, let's say, probably Microsoft, and they're a product manager, and they're responsible pretty much for a button within the bigger product for which some VP of product is responsible. So these people, they wouldn't have an access to the financial data of the button or of the product. So how do you see actually, like why do you think understanding the financials is important, even when you, for example, don't have an access to it? Or maybe everyone should have an access to financial data. How do you think?
I think that's a great question, Nikolai. So maybe two things. Like one, as I mentioned, it all depends on the maturity of the business, right? So you can take a startup. In a startup, everyone has access to the financials. It's a bread and butter, right? However, in a mature corporation like Microsoft, you have a very granular corporate structure with a lot of domains of expertise. Having depth in those domains of expertise is essential because that's what helps you to move the needle. And in many cases in such corporations, based on my experience, product managers don't have direct access or don't even have the mental capacity to really understand those financials, right? However, I do think it narrows the mindset, right? If you're going like in depth, whatever like you're optimizing for, be it a button or be it like a page, I mean, just part of the flow, part of user flow or whatnot, I do think it narrows your thinking, right? Because you become an expert of a button, of a call to action, rather than the expert of the business itself, right? Maybe the button you're optimizing for is a status quo bias. Maybe you should completely get rid of this button and create something completely different, right? That would generate even more value for the business. And in many cases, like product managers are not empowered to think in that way. That's the thing.
Mm-hmm. And how do financials work in at Bolt? Like, do your product managers have access to financials to you, or at least to what extent?
Well, yes, absolutely. So we have complete transparency when it comes to financials, and we have a direct say on how our P&Ls would look like. Essentially, you have multiple layers of financial data. So on the very top layer, you have what we call basically investment returns, or we measure it in IRR. This metric is needed for the board of directors, right? So that whatever we're investing in makes the best outcome for their buck, right? And these are typically the metrics that senior management looks into. For them, it helps to make trade-offs and decisions, right? On a lower level, on the vertical level, typically VPs work with those. You have profit and loss statements. They're also called income statements, and also like cash flow statements. These are basically show you how the business operates on a day-to-day basis and whether or not we're achieving like budget goals and whether or not we are actually meeting those ROI expectations that the board of directors expects us to reach, right? And even on a lower level of granularity, you have certain parts of this income statement and they are being owned by specific teams, right? So one team might be responsible for optimizing for, I don't know, a certain part of the costs, I don't know, improving the operational efficiency, like reducing the amount of operations that are being done, I don't know, improving verification flows, reducing the verification costs, and so on. Some teams might be responsible directly for the user experience side of things, and the user experience is actually very tied, very closely related to the top line of the revenues. Like, so it has a direct impact on that, and so on. So you have this kind of a 3-layer structure that works and which is interconnected, and everyone has visibility into it. Of course, depending on the seniority of the product manager, I would expect there are different expectations, right? So I wouldn't expect, for instance, a mid product manager to really understand how board of directors think, because it's not the best value that the product manager can create, right? However, if it is a senior or like principal level product manager, I would very much expect for him or her to step up and actually influence on how this like income statement is being created, what are the focus areas, and where can we move the needle the most.
It kind of leaves an impression that, let's say if I'm a product manager level, like not VP, not group, maybe middle or senior, then I would have mostly an access to, like, if I'm, let's say, revenue generating product, part of product, then I would probably have an access to revenue side of things, like probably transaction volumes, etc. If I am more like an expense, kind of like almost cost center product, responsible for cost center product, like let's say verifications, fraud prevention, whatever else, then I would probably only have access to this expenses side, like how much it costs me to run, I don't know, servers, to run this service, like cost per verification kind of thing. Does it sound correct?
Well, you will have access. It is more or less correct, but the only caveat is you will have access to everything, right? The question is, will you have the mental capacity to really go into higher level of abstractions and understand how most of the business works? Most likely you will not, right? So you'll go in depth, but yeah, you will have access to everything.
And there you also mentioned that there are key financial metrics. Are there general key financial metrics, or they would be key financial metrics would be different per product? How to approach it?
So if we look at the business, typically the goal of the business is to make profit, right? So the financial metrics, which are essentially proxies for that, are the same, right? So you have top line measured in net revenues, you have bottom line, and whatever is your success criteria. It could be operational profit, it could be EBITDA, right? It could be EBIT, right? Or maybe even net profit if you're that bullish. Those metrics are more or less the same. The nuances of how those metrics are calculated and what are the variables that contribute to those metrics are different for each business.
And just to be a bit of a translator, top line, it's a revenue, bottom line, profitability.
Bottom line are costs, basically, and the profit that you're generating at the end.
Thank you. And thinking about this financials and costs and etc., you probably anyway go and think strategically. There is an amazing post by Evgeny Kabanov, how to think strategically, and there he gives a bit of definition what strategy is. Very nice post, can recommend to go and read it. But I would kind of go and tease you, what do you mean by think strategically, not tactically? And extract key challenges in the long-term trends. Maybe it's a bad paraphrasing of what you said, but that's at least how I understood it.
No, it's a great question. So I think it's a dilemma that's not that very easy to solve, because I can tell you tactically short term, strategically long term, but I mean when it comes to practice, many product managers are lost. What does strategic thinking actually mean, right? And what specific outputs we expect from the product manager when we mean strategy? It's a good question, because many times, over the years, when I ask my product managers, hey, you need to have a great strategy for whatever you're working on, they said, great, I'm going to give you a strategy. And what they did, essentially, they copy-pasted their backlog into a document and said, well, hey, this is my strategy. I said, why is it a strategy? Well, because I'm tackling the highest importance, projects of highest importance, right? Ranked by ROI or RISE or whatever. So that's the problem, because for many product managers, the term strategy is very ambiguous. The way we now think about it is strategy are meaningful objectives that can help you move the needle for the business. It might sound very simple, right? But I think that creates a much better frame of mind for many product managers rather than bring me strategy. Because when strategy is a big word, many product managers are really intimidated by it. But when you just say, hey, I need for you to understand what are the leverage points that can move the business, that creates a totally different dynamic. And when we speak about leverage points, there could be many things, right? First thing I'm most interested in is whether or not a product manager understands where the biggest bottleneck in his domain, in her domain, or in the business is, right? Because that is probably the biggest leverage point. And optimizing for whatever else isn't really necessary, because this will be diminishing returns impact, right? And second thing I'm interested in, can a product manager create a great story around it? If yes, then it will be a much easier sell for the stakeholders, and most importantly for the team that product manager works with, because product manager needs to influence the team without having an authority. And what's a greater way of doing this if not telling the story, right? So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight of how we think about the strategy.
Yeah. Straight away question, you were saying about moving the needle.
Yeah.
And then product managers pick some ideas from the backlog which have the highest ROI. Isn't it the same thing?
Well, yes and no, right? Because it depends on how the backlog was created. In many cases, backlog is, a list of feature requests, right, that were prioritized based on what we knew about each of the requests. And the problem with that approach is that you don't know really, are you optimizing for the local maxima, or are you actually looking for a global maxima that can, double the revenue for the business? And that's a trap. Right. So I do think that backlog needs to be secondary, and this search for specific bottlenecks needs to be primary. So they kind of inform.
I really want some example. Like, do you maybe have an example from your experience, or maybe from interviews that you had, or maybe both?
Yeah. So I can give example from micromobility. Right. So let's say you have an operational app. Right. So you have, hundreds of people that are constantly on the street doing operations, like picking up scooters, swapping batteries, fixing scooters, and so on. All right. So, and they have an application that helps them to do their job. The application basically shows where the vehicles are on the map, what is the priority, and so on and so forth, basically. Imagine that what you're doing is that, you're adding a filter that will help you to distinguish between different types of vehicles, right? Of course, you're making the lives of operational guys on the ground a little bit easier, right? Maybe they will become a little bit more efficient, but at the end of the day, it's probably going to be negligible because you will not be able to measure the impact. Maybe like some of them will not even use this filter, based on my experience. Any interface improvements are rarely used. Like there is a really kind of a low adoption curve. That's a local maxima. But let's look on the opposite side. What could be a global maxima? It might turn out that you have a huge operational area. Let's say like 200 square kilometers. And you might have like 500 vehicles. And what will it mean, right? It would mean that more or less you have, 3 scooters, 1 scooter per square kilometer. And what that means is that in order for a person to find that scooter, like he or she will have to spend like 30 minutes of walking distance. And that means that you're not going to like capture the rides that you want to capture, right? And if you compare the potential order of magnitude of impact of both of those changes, they are just dramatically different in terms of the impact and in terms of the efforts that you're going to spend on fixing those. And that's why I'm very bullish on product managers thinking outside of the application and looking at the bigger picture rather than just optimizing for those local improvements.
Thank you. So like in an example with operations that you gave, the idea is that 200 square meters, was it 200 square meters?
Square kilometers. It's a massive distance.
Yes. Yeah, it's a bit more than 200 square meters. Okay, and 500 scooters. So basically the idea is how to basically increase the density of scooters. So
you just reduce the operational area. You just cut it twofold, and you have immediate uptake in utilization and in revenues. So that's the thing, right? But if you're optimizing for whatever operations are doing on the ground, you're just like bringing marginal.
Did you have such cases where you just decrease the operational area?
Well, we had, I would say, I would not be like very explicit, but we had cases where very small effort changes generated an outsized return in terms of the impact. And in many cases, those changes were outside of the application itself.
Yeah. I would probably jump over to the point that you just mentioned, thinking beyond the features. It was more of a flavor thing that you mentioned for specific for Bolt, but probably it's also used somewhere. How do people actually think beyond the features, especially given this example that you just gave? How to actually find this global maximas or think in terms of global maximas? Is it a skill that you can learn, or it's just experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it's about product managers not really being lazy sometimes, right? Of course, like the cases might be different, right? In certain instances, you might work on a domain that requires very in-depth expertise, like be it data science expertise or like some geo expertise or technical expertise. And this is probably where you can generate the most impact. But for such product managers, you typically have different expectations, right? But for an average generalist product manager, right, the way to build this is by stepping outside of the comfort zone. And the comfort zone is, well, this is my backlog, this is my team, like this is like my list of priorities that I'm constantly working with, like these are my like some small goals that I'm trying to improve on. But just step outside of it, like go talk to stakeholders, go talk to finance guys, go talk to operations. Try to empathize, try to see how they look at the problem, build this context for yourself. And once you look at the business from their lens, you would immediately start seeing the role that you had within this business, right? And how maybe biased or flawed it was, and you will start making changes. It will take time. In many cases, it might take maybe like more than a year to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Then a question, do you even make any feature changes? Let's say I'm your product manager under you. I probably come to you and say, hey, let's make this feature for our scooter app. What is the probability that you will grill this idea and definitely say no?
100%. Because what I'm expecting product manager to bring to the table are problems, not features, right? I don't really care what feature it will be, what would be the solution. Of course, unless it's an area of high sensitivity where the solution, you need to be like really specific about how it works, right? But what I'm actually expecting is the product manager to bring a problem on the table that makes sense, and that has like direct influence on how business operates.
Okay. So I shouldn't think even in terms of features, not even in terms of operational changes. I should even think just in terms of problems.
Yeah, not solutions, problems.
And who comes up with those features, ideas, solutions? Like I found you the problem and then...
Yeah. So of course, like different teams work it out differently, but in my experience, what works the best is having a discovery team on board, right? Personally, I'm not great at out-of-the-box thinking, I must confess. So every single solution that I bring has limited, creativity to it. But if you put multiple people together to work on the same problem, you're going to have a completely different solution, completely different quality. Like how I do it, right? So I come with let's say I'm an IC, individual contributor, working on a specific problem. So I outline a problem, and then I bring together what is called a discovery team. Discovery team consists of a lead engineer, of a product designer, if I'm lucky, also a UX researcher. And then I just tell them, hey guys, this is the problem. Let's figure out how to solve it, right? And we brainstorm together. And typically, like when you brainstorm with a team, like the solutions are just sometimes so elegant that you wouldn't be able to come up with them yourself, right? And when the team is involved, they also feel that they are owning this, right? They are part of this. They have a say in what the product actually does. And they're pumped because there will be more ownership from their side. Mm-hmm. And like the outcome of this might be a solution. It might be a change in like a feature, for instance. It might be a change in the process, or it might be, a change in how we look at the data, how we calculate certain things. It depends, right? Whatever makes sense given the context.
Does it then go to, I came up with a problem, I go to you, you say it's good, I go ideate it with all the people that you mentioned. Does it go straight to development, or again, I need to approve it in a hierarchy of people?
So the thing is, right, so when you have approvals, you have bottlenecks, right? It means that there's lack of trust. So in an ideal scenario, you're not coming to me, right? Because I'm not the person who needs to say like what you should or should not be doing, right? If you act as a business owner, you make decisions for yourself. So you come up with a problem, you think it has the highest priority, it makes sense, then you get a team together, you ideate. And then if the engineering is needed, let's say, it's a feature development, then of course you put it in a backlog and you work on it. Like the team puts it in a backlog and works on it. Then you might need to roll it out, right? If you take Bolt as an example, like we're present in hundreds of cities, and the local specifics might be different. So of course you need somebody to help you out, be it somebody from the central operations, or you might step in yourself to do the rollout. Or it might be a completely different dedicated person who's doing this, like a product specialist, for instance. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So just to add to the point of business ownership, you also need to have the authority. You take responsibility for whatever ideas you come up with, the problems that you find, the solutions that you ideate or build, but be ready that if it goes wrong, then you're responsible for it.
Essentially, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
But the important thing to keep in mind is that it cannot go wrong, right? There is no failure in product management. There is learning, right? So if it didn't go as you expected it to go, then it is a learning that you will reuse for the future iterations and experiments that will course correct you and set you on the right track of action.
Do you guys involved have, this product manager had 10 ideas, identified 10 problems, 9 out of 10 were a fail. Sorry, you have to go. Now let's go and find the new product manager. Does it work this way, or you tolerate fails? How would it work basically?
Well, we don't think through those lens, right? So what we rather look at are competencies, right? Because you cannot really judge a person by the amount of successful launches that a person has made, right? It's not entirely objective. What is more important is, was this person what was the problem solving like? What was the collaboration like? What was the business thinking like? And all of the other key skills that a product manager could have. What was the seniority behind them? Does a product manager really understand why a certain thing worked versus why a certain thing didn't? It is super important, right? If a product manager fully understands this and accepts the responsibility, then, it's a super senior product manager that will generate outsized impact, maybe not immediately this year, but definitely in the years to come. And what you're saying, what you're describing is, let's say 10 projects, out of 10 projects, only one worked out. There might be two things, right? It might be very positive and might be very negative, right? If it is a very positive thing, then you had a great strategy, you tested most of the hypotheses that you had, and out of them one worked out, and maybe it generated an impact that covered for the losses of the other 10, for the other 9, sorry. Why not?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it might be that you were continuously crunching out some local features, improvements, and none of them has made a dent, right, in the impact for the company. And what that would signal to me is that a product manager doesn't have a proper strategy in place. And this is what we should coach, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than immediately let go of a product manager. So I do think that just the mindset of how we look at this is different.
It kind of led to culture, motivation, and some soft skills. It's an interesting thing that you mentioned that you have a coaching. Basically, how would it work? Would it be you who coaches me, mm-hmm. or there's a whole team mm-hmm. for coaching?
No, that's a great question and great way to put it. I would say that there is a support system in place, right? The important principle is that product manager's growth is as much product manager's responsibility as it is a product leader's responsibility. From the product leader side, the important thing is to build a support system that will help the product manager to grow specific skills, right? But if there is no intent from the product manager to grow, then it might not even happen, right? But let's assume that the intent is there. So what is a support system? Support system means that one product leader dedicates weekly time, maybe even a week, an hour, to go through the key areas of growth and tries to unpack them the way he or she sees them and have this open conversation with the product manager. Second thing is, I typically try to structure the teams in such a way that there is a good enough seniority mix. So I would have senior people who could coach more junior ones, so they could also dedicate time and share their perspective. Because I think this learning only happens when you're exposed to multiple perspectives, right? Not just on the product leader alone, right? When only the product leader is the one who does the coaching, one interesting thing happens. Product manager starts parroting the product leader, especially when he was a junior product manager. He tries to copy paste everything, the mindset, the mental model, the behaviors. It could be a good thing, right, for a specific company, but it's best when you're exposed to multiple points of views, right? Yeah, and depending on what skills you need to coach, the solution should be different. And depending on where you're at, it should also be different. So, yeah.
And I like this idea of that you see that there is intent, that there is a motivation in product manager. How do you understand that there is motivation, that there's intent in the eyes?
It's typically very simple, right? The person who doesn't have intent feels like a victim of circumstances, right? And is very defensive. The person who has an intent to grow is very open, right? And treats everything as an opportunity to grow rather than something that limits the possibilities for growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a nice way to put it. I would shift from culture and motivation, even though like it's interesting to see that you actually guys have an actual system like for helping your team members to grow. And probably that's an interesting difference. Like Bolt probably is already a mature company that can set up this system and kind of not like, oh, we don't have time for this, let's fire and hire a new one. Like actually there's a, as I said, support system. But a point that you mentioned, the other point is product mindset, kind of related to it. And three main things that you defined there is product identification, user identification, and value proposition. Today we kind of talked that you need to figure out the problem, and you would prefer if your product manager brings you the problem and doesn't even bring the problem to you, but works on the problem. But then identifying the user, that's kind of what kind of a little bit killed it for me. And then raised a bigger question. Like Bolt is quite already, I don't want to say super mature company, but already it has the user base, it has some business, and there's stuff to work with. Do I really need to like actually go and identify the user? Like, does it actually, this three-point formula of user, problem, and value proposition, does it actually apply to a mature company like Bolt? Because kind of many things are already figured out. You kind of can learn the business context from people around you. And then it's not like really exactly like, oh, I need to figure out the user, the problem. It's so new and so challenging. Like, or do you have a different take on it?
I think it's an amazing question and a great way to put it. So I'll probably split it into two parts. Like one is I'll kind of reiterate on what do I mean by having a product mindset. I think there are two core components, right? You can break them down even further into like user, value proposition, and so on. But I think the two core components is one, are you able to detect the pattern? And two, are you able to identify the problem, pinpoint it very accurately? What I'm seeing is that the higher seniority of people, the more, like the better they are at it. Sometimes a seemingly very complex situation, if you identify the problem correctly, you can have like a very simple solution, very simple and elegant one that doesn't really require much efforts, right? Then the second point is, should you, at the level of maturity of Bolt, really identify the users and pinpoint them? You absolutely should. I can explain why. In many corporate environments, especially when you're working with what I call mass appeal products, the product started virally growing because it hit the sweet spot. It had like the product market fit, and it approached like this wide range of people, like very like wide audiences, right? For instance, like ride hailing. It could be used by anyone out there. Doesn't matter what age group, like which sex, and I don't know, which religious beliefs or whatnot. There is almost like every single time you have a use case for it. And this is what I call like a mass appeal product. And especially for products that started off 10 years ago, like for instance, Bolt did, it started with a very like wide, I would say, user persona in mind. And that worked out greatly. There are many examples where it actually works. But then once you kind of capture all of your early adopters, or maybe even late adopters, if you want to cross that boundary and go even deeper and improve the value, you really have to understand what specific persona you're working with, right? If I'm kind of I can bring an example of Drive, right? When you launch a car sharing business, you're like working with a generic car sharing rider. More or less, you might have some specific demographic in mind, right, that you optimize for. But once you hit the plateau, you need capture incremental use cases, right? And for that, you need to figure out like how people are making trips. For instance, a family needs a child seat for a weekend long trip. Like how big is, what is their pattern? Like what are their problems? Why do they need a child seat? What type of a child seat? Where it should be placed? How should we communicate about that? How should we make it visible and help the users to select it? So if all of those things align, you could successfully capture and bring value to an additional audience that will just expand your business even further. But even more so, you might challenge the existing status quo notions about this general audience that you've been working with, those early adopters. Maybe you could improve something for them if you really understand how they think, and so on and so forth. So I had like multiple cases like that.
So it's still like, even in a mass product, you still need to go and narrow down kind of the scope of users that you focus on.
Yes,
for
absolutely.
each and every problem, because everyone has different problems.
Yeah.
I love talking to guys from hospitality because they talk a lot about the experience. The experience, for example, when you go to a hotel or to a restaurant, your experience matters a lot. And that's kind of basically the value proposition. I remember once you said something like, you don't like the metric of Net Promoter Score or something like this. So what makes a great value proposition? The one that users love, or the one that moves the metric, even if users don't really like it?
Okay, yeah, it's a great question. So I'm just gonna quote our Bolt's president, JK. So the way we see this is that value proposition is split into two parts. So there is a hard value proposition and there is a soft value proposition. Hard meaning everything that you can quantify. Typically, that's the most important thing for the customer. It can be price, it can be time, it can be efforts, or any other measurable resources that are being spent. And a soft value proposition is more about the brand, the user experience, the look and feel, emotional aspects that are less tangible and much harder to quantify. And your value proposition is always relative to other competitors in the industry that you operate in. Ideally, you need to provide the best value proposition if you want customers to gravitate towards your product. Best, first and foremost, in terms of hard value proposition, because it impacts 80% of the decision making. So that kind of a frame of mind informs how we make priorities. Right? If a product manager is working on some UX improvements, it might be okay, right? If it is a mature business that has been around for a while, and making copyright improvements actually can influence the revenues, right? But if you're earlier stage of the business, I would expect product managers to have much more focus on the hard value proposition at the cost of everything else. And typically, hard value proposition, when you make price optimizations, that's what moves the needle the most, right? When you help your customers reduce the time, that's what helps to move the needle. Of course, there are exceptions to this, when you have commodity products, that don't have price, right? That don't really have a hard value proposition attached to it. If you take browsers, for example, they're free of use, right? Then how do you compete? And what is the value proposition there? But that's a totally different discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it kind of we were mentioning, or you were mentioning it throughout the whole episode many times. For example, in business ownership, you need to have the context of the business. When you are thinking strategically, you need to understand the global maxima, and for this you need business context. To think beyond the future, you need to build the context. Figure out with finances, with operations, with product, with engineers, kind of what the context is. And what is the context of Bolt? What are the things that I need to understand in order to be successful product manager? Yeah,
it's a tricky question, to be honest, but I'll try to approach it from a more kind of a abstract perspective, because every single team and what is implied by context within the team could be different, right? But how I would see this, right, if you're a product manager that just joined the company, the context for you would consist of multiple elements. So one is what's the unit economics behind the business? Two, what's the strategy? Is it informed by the business or is it informed by the product? What's the current strategy? If it is there, if it is not, it is also the case for you to work on, right? Three, like what's the roadmap? Like what has been like the highest priority things that we've been working on? Four, like who is our user? What's like who's the persona? What are the pain points? How our users think, short term, long term, what matters, what doesn't matter. Four, I would map out those stakeholders and their dynamics. It's super important for you to kind of build trust with them, inform them, so they can help you out as well to make changes. And of course, five, I think, number five is like your peers that you work with, be it in engineering, in design, in data analytics, or maybe even other vertical or horizontal teams, right? Just talk to them, right? And once you pass, I would say like 4-6 months, kind of a threshold, things will start making sense for you. You'll start in a bigger picture. You'll start building a bigger picture. It will just click. And this is the moment where you're going to have context. And it is evolving all the time, because the context that you have in your first year is completely different from the context that you have in 2 or 3 years' time, right? I would even say that there is a certain context limit to how much you can learn from the company. You typically, as an individual contributor, you reach this context limit within like 3-4 years, I think, unless you're continuously shifting like domains, right? You're changing teams, you're working on different products in one organization. So yeah, that I think roughly answers your question.
Yeah. So you mentioned understand unit economics, understand strategy, roadmap, who's the user, your stakeholders, and then peers. So kind of 6 points for if you join the Bolt, what you should kind of learn. I guess
any
not
generic
Bolt,
company,
but, any company. And talking about specifically about Bolt, there are some kind of dynamics that are specific for their business. You do guys marketplaces most of the time. What are the key points, maybe what I need to understand about the business to be a successful product manager?
It's also a great question. So first things first, we are a marketplace business. And the thing you should understand is that for this business to do its job, it needs to successfully align the interest between demand side and the supply side. Demand being the user, supply being, let's say like the rider, and the supply being the driver. If you do that successfully, then click happens. That means that you have marketplace liquidity. But it is easier said than done, because like marketplaces, they have different stages. When you're just starting your marketplace, if you don't have sufficient supply side, then your demand is not going to come, right? Because why come? It's just going to churn. What's the value? If you don't have sufficient demand side, then your supply is going to churn because they're not seeing value. They're just not making money out of being on your platform. And those dynamics might change as your business matures. And those dynamics also might be disrupted on every single stage of your business. And most importantly, the marketplaces are winner takes all businesses. So your goal is to achieve the market dominance in a limited time frame. Market dominance mean you have like more than 50% of the market share. That's the moment in time when you get the pricing power, and you have a much stronger you have like much stronger outlook for the business in terms of the profits that you can generate. Yeah, otherwise you'll be continuously burning money. That's it.
Yeah, like before this episode, I also read your blog. By the way, a shameless ad, Mikhail has his own blog, Corporate Waters, and there was a nice post about how marketplace businesses work. I like that you kind of listed some points like you need the market liquidity, demand supply, network effect, and there was this cold start problem. And I was thinking about it like cold start problem is very like relevant for the marketplaces that just start. But if it's already existing business, like for example, Bolt is, do they still have cold start problem with existing markets? Probably with new markets, yes. But existing markets, like would product manager experience much problem called start problem?
Well, yeah, great question. Yes, a product manager will. Why so? Because we are at the growth stage, which means that we're expanding to new markets. And every single new market is a marketplace that you have to build from the scratch. You have to figure out the supply side, you have to figure out the demand side of things, and you need to make the liquidity work for you. So yes, every product manager will face this.
Yeah. And on this marketplace experience and domain context topic, the more I thought about it, the more it kind of started feeling like actually to be a successful product manager, it doesn't seem to be important like to have actual like education or nice certificate, diplomas, completed courses, whatever. It seems to be more about the experience and like exposure to this business context and domain and such stuff. And then I remembered that you were saying that Bolt doesn't hire for junior product managers or something like this, that you basically hire from within Bolt, from other positions. So is it the thing that Bolt believes that for like to be a great product manager, you need a lot of business context, or
Okay.
does Bolt not believe in it?
Yeah. Thanks, Nikolai, for the question. I'll maybe kind of correct it a bit, right? So we are looking for product managers of different seniority levels, but our expectation bar might be higher than the average company. That's why in certain cases we even down level, like people that come like from the senior product manager background are being evaluated as mid-level product managers, or like GPMs are being down leveled as seniors and so on. So we don't have any specific restrictions there. Like we look at all markets, at all backgrounds, at all hubs, all seniority levels. I even have like an associate product manager in my team, so which is like a junior product manager. On the other side, what's the background, and do we actually look at the backgrounds? I would say a horrible thing right now, but the certifications, they might decrease your chances for getting a job, because like there is a very high correlation between Agile, Scrum Master, and all of those sorts of stuff certificates and low problem solving skills. That's the problem. And I typically don't even look at the like certifications and whatever like awards that the person had. What I'm more interested in is just like the pure problem solving, the mindset, the storytelling bit. So you learn the most from having the actual interview. And I typically look at the CV only in the cases where I'm kind of concerned, where I don't really know like whether it's a right decision to make to kind of cancel this candidate or reject this candidate or to go on. But yeah, I think you're like to kind of wrap it all up. We look at different seniority levels. The hiring bar is high. We don't look at certifications at all. Even so, your certifications can even decrease your chances for getting the job. We look at the experience heavily, but like 90% of the evaluation is being done through the actual conversation with the candidate.
Thank you. Well, we kind of covered all 6 points, but there's one more thing that I want to ask. Maybe you can bring up some examples for each point. Like, how would you evaluate business ownership in an interview? Like, for example, you were saying that I need the person to be able to move the needle. The person understands the business context, being able to take responsibility. How would you evaluate that person can take responsibility and can move the needle?
It's a great question. So very simple. I have like a generic case. It might be very different depending on the interview, but typically like build me a business, right? Like product managers are typically divided. Of course, it's very rough classification, but in two categories. So one category is like, okay, that's a business. I need to build a feature. So the product manager like starts thinking about like what's the user, what is the specific feature we can, like what's the problem, what's the feature that can help to kind of solve that problem, and so on. So to me, that signals kind of a lack of business ownership and understanding of the bigger context. On the other side, the product manager might zoom out say like, hey, okay, like what's the market, right? What's the business model behind it? What is important for this business model? Is it a marketplace? If it's a marketplace, like what's the demand? What is the supply side of things, right? And how do we optimize for both? And then like what's our go-to-market plan and so on. And the product manager doesn't even mention an application or a feature a single time. That to me is a great case of business ownership.
And while thinking about strategy, like how can you evaluate quickly if the person is good at strategic thinking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great one also. It typically shows indirectly, but how I am evaluating this is whether or not the product manager is focusing on the right things, on the highest importance things, right? That can move the needle. That will be the case.
Mm-hmm. And the product mindset probably somehow interlinks with business ownership and strategic thinking, but can you evaluate it quickly?
You cannot evaluate it fully during the interview. Of course, that's a constraint, but you can at least get a sense. I look at it very simply, right? Does a candidate think about the user, about the problem? And what is important is that is the candidate specific about it? Because by saying that, hey, let's say my user is a writer, what does it even mean, right? So you're saying that everyone is your user essentially. Then what should be the problem? Then any problem would fit. And does the candidate think about the value proposition and focuses on the right things? Well, that would be key for me, right? And additionally, it's the problem solving itself. So if you give an ambiguous case to the candidate and the candidate can break it down into like a logical tree structure and then just stick to it, both combined together would signal that it's a strong product mindset.
And about the seniority, how do you evaluate the candidate's seniority? Also by these three criteria, and then you just give points like 5 out of 10 for each criteria. So it must be middle, 10 out of 10 must be VP, or there's
great question. So there are two dimensions to it. So one is the seniority, how the candidate responded, like during the interview, how mature was the candidate in terms of understanding like the product, the business, the data, like the users. So you typically evaluate it indirectly. Or like if it is a leadership candidate, how savvy that candidate was in people management. On the other side, you have a different dimension, which is the actual skills. Yes, we rank all the skills on a numeric scale, and then based on the end result, we kind of we see what's the outcome.
Nice, thank you. And to wrap it a little bit, so basically there are 3 main points by which Bolt evaluates candidates. Kind of.
There are more, but these are non-negotiables, right?
Yeah, there are 3 essential criteria: business ownership, strategic thinking, and product mindset. For business ownership, they're looking if you are able to move the needle, if you understand the context, and if you are able to take the authority for whatever ideas or problems you identify and be able to actually deliver them. There's strategic thinking. It's a lot about also understanding the context, understanding the business case, and being able to identify the bottleneck in the business and actually kind of come up with a great story. How can this something actually impact the business in a positive way? I also think about the local maximas and global maximas, like think about bigger changes, bigger impact ideas rather than small tweaks. And the third one is the product mindset. So think about problem identification and user identification. You still need to think about your users' specific segments, think about their problems. They can be very specific, and think about value proposition. Value proposition can be hard and soft. For now, focus on hard. Soft is also important, but maybe at more mature stage of the company. Of course, think about the marketplace dynamics, think beyond the features, and also culture, motivation, soft skills. You still need them. They're important. And that seems to be it. Mikhail, maybe there is something else that you want to add to the list?
No, just to reflect, like everything that you listed might sound really intimidating for some of the candidates. So my point is that you shouldn't try to follow this list of requirements as a checkbox, right? But rather invest into building the actual skills, because the actual skills will help you to live up to all of those expectations. Yeah,
I can only agree. And that's also the thing that you mentioned over and over during today's episode. That's really great. Thank you, Mikhail, for joining today's episode. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Make sure to follow Corporate Waters by Mikhail, and make sure to follow Tallinn Product Group. We post new episodes or new posts every week on Thursday. So thank you.
No, thank you, Nikolai. It has been a great conversation.